A tall thing needs a wide base. Any worker who has stacked bricks in a yard knows that in his hands. But in Manhattan, the builders went the other way on purpose, and they sold the width instead. The Burj Khalifa in Dubai sits on 3 wide wings of concrete. A tower on Park Avenue in New York sits on a square barely 90 feet across. Wind pushes on both towers. Air is heavy, and moving air has weight behind it. Only one of them needed machines at the top to keep the rooms quiet. At first, this might just seem like a matter of taste in architecture. One shape in Dubai, another in Manhattan. But width at the base is money, and in Manhattan, the price of that width runs to millions of dollars a floor. So here is the question. What does a tower give up when it trades width for height? Who pays for that trade 10 years after the last check has cleared? You have stood on a stepladder and felt it flex under your feet in still, warm air. Now imagine that feeling in a warm apartment, high above Park Avenue, on an ordinary Tuesday, with the wind up and the windows shut. Start with the number that governs everything: slenderness. Engineers describe a tower by the width of its base against its height. A squat building gets a low number. A needle gets a high one. The Skyscraper Museum in New York puts the threshold for a slender tower at around 10. Below that, wind is somebody else's problem. Above it, wind becomes the design. The old North Tower of the World Trade Center came in under 7. Wide, heavy, and by modern standards enormously wasteful of Manhattan land. Nobody builds like that on Park Avenue now, because the ground underneath is worth too much to sit on. To understand what happened next, you have to stop looking at the skyline and start reading the deed for the land. Here is the trade every developer in New York makes. Every foot of base is a foot of Manhattan you have bought and cannot sell as a view. So the base shrinks and the tower climbs. The Park Avenue tower rises just under 1/4 of a mile. Its footprint is a square of about 90 feet. Divide height by width, and the slenderness lands at 15. Another Manhattan tower goes further still, past 20. The Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat has tracked that shift for years. The engineering behind it is not new. The economics are. A developer who widens a base in Manhattan is writing off land he has already paid for, and no buyer will ever reimburse him for it. Now the interesting part. A slender tower does not fall over. Nobody in New York is worried about that, and neither am I. A slender tower moves. Here is how the wind actually works on a tall building. Wind does not push a building in a steady line. Air peels off the corners in curls, first one side and then the other, and the curls arrive at a rhythm. When that rhythm lines up with the natural rhythm of the tower swings a little further on each push. Engineers call the effect vortex shedding, which means the wind is taking turns on each side of the building. Now the two answers. The engineers at the Burj Khalifa answered that problem with shape. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill gave the Burj Khalifa 3 wings around a central spine. Then the design team stepped those concrete wings back at different heights on the way up, so the wind never meets the same edge twice as it climbs. What follows is that second approach being taken apart, one piece at a time. This channel exists to take apart systems like this one, so if that is what you came for, subscribe and stay with it. The measured result matters here, and it decided a budget. The Burj Khalifa never had to pay for a damper, because the shape did the job. The Burj Khalifa completes its slowest full sway in about 11 seconds. A resident at the top would never feel it as a push. The design team reported that the motion sat inside the comfort range, published by the International Organization for Standardization, with no extra machinery on the roof. Now picture the person who installs the alternative. A damper technician works in a room most residents never enter. The machine room near the crown of a supertall tower in New York is loud, warm, and cramped. Getting there is a lift ride that runs for minutes. He arrives with a clipboard and a torque wrench and a work order. Here is what he has come for. The mass he has come to inspect weighs 660 tons. 2 of those masses hang on cables near the crown of the Park Avenue Tower. Think of it as a heavy pendulum on a leash. When the tower leans one way, the mass swings the other way, and the swing pulls the energy out of the movement. Engineers call the machine a tuned mass damper, which means the pendulum is set to match the exact rhythm of that one building and no other. The firm that designed those 2 dampers is called Motioneering. Motioneering belongs to the same wind engineering group, RWDI, that ran the wind tunnel work for the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. Hold on to that fact. One consultancy advised both towers. One client bought shape, the other client bought machinery, and then bought the power, the inspections, and the spare parts that come with machinery. What else did the narrow tower have to buy? The first thing is air gaps. The Park Avenue Tower has 5 double-height floors, open on every side. The open floors sit roughly every 12 stories up the building. No apartment sits on any of them. Wind blows straight through. The purpose is to break up those curls of air before they can build a rhythm. Count the cost of that decision. 5 floors of Manhattan, in the most expensive postcode on Earth, that nobody will ever sell. The second thing is the frame itself. The Park Avenue Tower uses outriggers, which means stiff arms reaching from the central core out to the corner columns, so the whole footprint works as one stiff tube. 5 of those arms sit inside the Park Avenue Tower. Each arm is 2 stories deep. The concrete at the bottom is rated at 14,000 pounds per square inch. Think of it as roughly 3 times the strength of the mix in an ordinary parking garage. The structural engineers of record were WSP Cantor Sainuk. The architect was Raphael Vignoli. The contractor was Lend-Lease. None of that is cheap. All of it exists because the base in Manhattan is barely 90 feet wide. So the engineering answers the wind. Does the engineering answer everything else? In 2021, the condominium board at 432 Park Avenue filed suit in the Supreme Court of the state of New York. The board sought damages above $250 million. An engineer hired by the board reported more than 1,000 alleged defects in the common areas alone. Be careful with what that sentence does and does not say. Everything in that filing is an allegation in a live dispute in New York. Treat this as a video about a lawsuit, not a verdict. The sponsor of the building has stated publicly that the tower delivers the finest level of service, world-class amenities, and state-of-the-art technology. What sits in the filings is specific, and it is worth reading closely. A single water leak damaged more than 30 apartments in the Park Avenue Tower. Half the residential lifts were then out of service for weeks. An electrical arc flash followed, caused when a contractor drilled into live wiring, and emergency repairs were reported above $1 million. Residents have described noise, vibration, and lifts that stopped between floors and held people inside for hours. 4 years later, residents in Manhattan filed again. The second filing concerned cracking in the facade. Reporting that year put the repair bill for the Park Avenue Tower into 9 figures. Now the honest part. Nobody has proved in a New York court that slenderness caused any of it, and I am not going to tell you that it did. Water leaks happen in short buildings. Contractors drill into live wiring in short buildings. What slenderness changes is the consequence. Here is why. A wide, stiff tower absorbs a mistake. A slender tower passes it on. When a narrow building moves, every surface inside the building moves too. A pipe joint that would sit still for 40 years in a low block gets flexed thousands of times a year. A lift shaft that stays true in a wide tower is pulled slightly out of line with every gust. And a lift is the least forgiving machine in any building, because it is a car running on steel rails inside a shaft that will not hold a fixed shape. Remember the man with the torque wrench in the machine room. His 2 dampers protect the people in the apartments on Park Avenue. The dampers do nothing at all for the pipework. Here is the part of the trade nobody puts in a brochure. In a wide tower like the Burj Khalifa, the movement a pipe has to absorb is small enough that an ordinary bracket handles it for the life of the building. In a slender tower in New York, the same bracket is working every windy day. A bracket is a cheap part. Replacing a cheap part on floor 70 is not cheap. Reaching it means a lift, a permit, and a resident who is home. The Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat has written about this pattern in super tall residential towers for years. Systems age out long before structures do. A lift in New York is replaced decades before a column is. The facade of the Park Avenue Tower is held together with sealant, which means the flexible compound squeezed between panels to keep water out. Sealant has a shorter life than the glass it holds. So the real running bill for a slender tower is not repair. The bill is access. Every part in the building has to be reached. In a lift, past a resident, on a schedule agreed with a board. Now the money question that decides all of it. What is the width worth? Manhattan land in the blocks around Park Avenue trades at prices that make the arithmetic brutal. Widening a base by 50 feet on each side removes a strip of ground the developer has already bought. And the strip that gets removed is not cheap ground at the edge of a city. The strip is some of the most expensive dirt in the United States. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill never faced that arithmetic at the Burj Khalifa. MR was building on the edge of a desert, on land the state had released, in a district that did not exist yet. A wide base in Dubai in that decade cost the project almost nothing in land value, so the Burj Khalifa took the cheap answer, which happens to be the answer that never sends a bill again. Look at what that means for the two towers side by side. One tower solved the wind before the concrete was poured and paid for it in ground. The other tower solved the wind after the shape was fixed. It pays in machinery, in inspections, and in floors that will never be sold. Neither choice is a mistake. The two towers were built on completely different land markets, and the land market chose the engineering. But first, there is a third party in this story that almost never gets named: the resident. A resident does not read a slenderness figure. A resident hears a sound. In a slender tower, the sounds that come with movement are specific, and they repeat. A door that latches in still air and rattles in a gust. A wine glass that rings on a shelf. A lift that levels a fraction slow. A shower screen that clicks once, then again, then stops for a month. None of those things is a defect on its own. Any building engineer in New York will tell you so, and most of the time the engineer is right. But a resident who paid for silence did not buy an engineering explanation. He bought a quiet room, and the sound arrives anyway. That mismatch is the reason so many super tall disputes end up with lawyers rather than engineers. The building is performing to a standard. The room is not performing to a promise. Nobody wrote the promise down, because the promise was made in a marketing suite. Remember the trade at the start of all this. A developer on Park Avenue sold width to buy height, and the buyer on floor 70 paid the same price twice. He paid once in the purchase, in a tower that had to be narrow to be worth building. He pays again every quarter, in the service charge that keeps two heavy machines swinging above his ceiling. The Burj Khalifa buyer in Dubai does not have that second line on his bill, not because Amar was more careful, but because desert land was cheap enough that the wide answer was the affordable one. Now the standards, and what they do not cover. The American Society of Civil Engineers writes the loading standard that tells an engineer how hard the wind will push on a given tower. The current version is numbered ASCE 7. What no standard writes down is how a resident on floor 70 feels about a wine glass that rings on a windy night. No standard writes down who pays when the lift jams. Here is one more cost nobody quotes at the sale: insurance. A tower on Park Avenue with a live construction defect claim is a different risk to an underwriter than a tower without one. Premiums for the building are paid by the residents through the same service charge that pays for the dampers. So a dispute about engineering turns into a line item on an invoice, years before any court in New York rules on anything. Remember what the Burj Khalifa avoided. Emaar bought its answer in ground, once, and no underwriter has ever had to price a damper outage in Dubai. How do you measure whether a slender tower is behaving? You measure it with instruments near the top, reading acceleration, and you compare those readings against a comfort limit rather than a safety limit. A super tall tower is structurally safe long before it is pleasant to live in. That gap between safe and pleasant is where every argument about tall buildings in New York actually lives. Then the operational questions start, and none of them has a number for an answer. Is the movement inside the limit the developer promised, or inside the limit the code requires? Who chose that limit, and when? When both dampers come offline for service, what does the building feel like that week? Who tells the residents, and who pays if they decide to leave? There are 4 ways to deal with all this. Every one of them costs somebody something. The first is shape, which is the Burj Khalifa answer in Dubai. Shape costs nothing to run and a great deal to buy, because a wide base in Dubai eats ground the developer could have sold. That cost lands on the owner, once, at the very start. The second is mass at the top, which is the Park Avenue answer. 2 heavy dampers cost money to install, and they cost money every year in inspection and in power. That cost lands on the residents through the service charge, and it lands forever. The third is holes in the building, again on Park Avenue. The open floors on Park Avenue are floors of revenue nobody will ever collect. The cost lands on the developer, and it never comes back. The fourth is doing less of all 3 and living with more movement. The cost lands on the person on floor 80, and it arrives first as noise, then as a lift ride that stops. Eventually, it arrives as a lawyer. Notice the shape of that list. The first 3 were bought once, before anyone moved in. Only the 4th keeps arriving, and it arrives in the post. A buyer walking through a marketing suite on Park Avenue in Manhattan hears none of this. The buyer sees 10-foot ceilings. The buyer sees a square window taller than a man, and a city that looks silent from up there. The stillness of the room feels like a feature of the building. Stillness in a slender tower is not a feature. Stillness is a running cost, and it appears on a service charge every quarter. But first, look at what an engineer from RWDI sees in the same room. An engineer from RWDI sees 2 masses on cables above the ceiling, doing their work in the dark. The engineer sees 5 empty floors below him in the Park Avenue tower that somebody chose not to sell. The engineer sees a frame that is stiff because a developer in Manhattan bought stiffness instead of another 100 feet of Park Avenue. What follows is a hypothetical engineering stress test. It is not a description or a prediction of an actual event at any specific tower. Imagine a slender residential tower in a cold city, not unlike the ones on Park Avenue. Both dampers come out for a scheduled overhaul in the same month, because the maintenance contract was written that way to save money. Now add the windiest week of the New York year. Add a facade program on the north elevation, with panels temporarily unbolted and the joint compound between them still curing. Add a lift modernization in one shaft, so the remaining lifts carry the whole building. Add a burst riser on a mechanical floor, with water running down a shaft overnight. Now the questions arrive in a row, and the tower has no single owner of the answer. Is the movement people are reporting normal for this wind, or is it the missing dampers? Are the lifts stopping because of the shaft, or because of the modernization? Who signs the notice to residents? Who pays for the hotel rooms if that notice says leave? Notice what has not happened in that scenario. Nothing structural failed. The frame did exactly what RWDI and the designers expected it to do. What failed was a schedule that assumed those 5 things would never land in the same month. That is the real difference between the Burj Khalifa in Dubai and a slender tower in New York. The Burj Khalifa bought its calm once. The calm is built into concrete, into a wide base and 3-stepped wings, and the bill was paid before anyone moved in. A slender tower rents its calm. The rent is paid in machinery, in maintenance and in service charges, and it falls due every quarter for as long as the building stands. Both are legitimate engineering. Only one of them keeps sending invoices. If you want to understand the hidden systems that keep enormous cities functioning, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Here is the question for the comments. Have you ever lived or worked high up in a narrow building and actually felt it move? Tell us which building it was and what you noticed first. This video describes general engineering principles. Claims about defects at any named tower are allegations in litigation and have not been proven in court. Nothing here says any building is unsafe. The stress test sequence is an explicitly hypothetical illustration. Footage is stock. The video is educational content, not a professional assessment.